Ezekiel. That's where we're left off. We made it through Jeremiah and Lamentations that was talking about the fall of Jerusalem and the deportations. Remember those 3 deportations where people were taken into exile? Well, Ezekiel is a book. It's a prophet in transition. Ezekiel, the name means God will strengthen. He's a priest that will actually become a prophet. His father is associated with the priesthood. The entire book, it has a great emphasis on the priesthood and shows his priestly background. The holiness, there's a great deal about temple, unclean, clean, Torah, legal codes. All this shows that he was someone who was related to the priesthood. And which is important for understanding his visions of the restoration of Judah and Jerusalem, that he was related to the priesthood. He was taken in the first deportation. That would be 597 is when he would be taken. He was 25 years old when he was taken, which is the age in which a person becomes a priest. At 592, when he was 30 years old, he will receive his call to the Lord. This is important because it follows the priesthood line. This is the time when he would have been starting to serve in the temple. And so this, when we know, with all this, we're following this priesthood line. He was 25 when he gets taken into captivity, when he normally would have been starting to become a priest. He's 30 years old when he first received his first temple, when he would have been normally serving in the temple. At 571, when he's 50 years old, he receives his last vision. And the important thing about that is, at 50 is when you retire from the priesthood. So his entire ministry, he desires to be a priest in the temple, and he never gets to do it. But he receives his first ministry when he would have been starting, and he receives his last one when he would have been retiring. It's actually pretty cool how they build on this imagery of the priest in the book of Ezekiel. He'll be a prophet exclusively to those who are in exile. He prepares the people for the fall of Jerusalem after he's taken in the first exile. So he takes people in the first exile, and then he prepares the people for the fall because he knows it's coming. He does not support a quick return from exile. Some people were saying, "Oh, this is going to be for a short little bit." And remember, Jeremiah was also, it's not going to be short. It's going to be a long exile. And he's like, Ezekiel will concur. It's going to be a God's complete time. 70 years is what he says. Considering that it's God's completeness, when God's turn is. He'll become a prophet of hope after the fall of Jerusalem. And he will spend his entire life in Babylon. All right, so let's take a brief look at it. I know some of you are like, Ezekiel's your book, and some of you are like, I've never read it. But we're not going to be able to touch on everything that's in this book. There's just too much in there for an intro. So if I miss your thing, sorry. But we're going to look briefly at the book. Chapters 1 through 24 are oracles against Jerusalem, supporting that Jerusalem has fallen and will fall. Chapters 25 through 32 will be oracles against the foreign nations, even though God is going to use the foreign nations to destroy, punish Jerusalem. he still brings oracles against the nations. And then 33 through 48 are oracles of hope about restoration in the land and restoration of worship. So always ends in hope. A very good thing. All right. We're going to look at a few of the chapters in here. We're not going to look at many of them, but let's look at some of the big ones. Let's turn to Ezekiel 1. We're going to read Ezekiel 1, 4 through probably 28-ish. How's that sound? Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 4. I know some of you aren't done. Let me see what my next slide is. There we go. Okay. All right. Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 4. I looked, and there was a whirlwind coming from the north, a huge cloud with fire flashing back and forth and brilliant lights all around it. In the center of the fire was a gleam like amber. The likeness of 4 living creatures came from it. And this was their appearance. They looked something like human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. The legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like hooves of calves, sparkling like the gleam of polished bronze. They had human hands under their their wings on 4 sides, and all 4 of them had faces and wings, and their wings were touching, and the creatures did not turn as they moved. Each one went straight ahead. Their faces looked something like the face of a human. Each of them had face of a lion on the right, and the face of an ox on the left, and the face of an eagle. That is what their faces were like. Their wings were spread upward. Each had 2 wings touching that another, and 2 wings covering the body. Each creature went straight ahead. Whenever the spirit wanted to go, they went without turning as they moved. The likeness of each living creature was like that of an appearance of a blazing coal of fire, or like torches. Fire was moving back and forth between the living creatures. It was bright with lightning coming out of the eyes. The creatures were darting back and forth like flashes of lightning, and they looked at the living creatures, and there was one wheel on the ground beside each 4-faced creature. Then the appearance of the wheels of their craftsmanship was gleaming of beryl. All 4 had the same likeness. Their appearance of craftsmen was like a wheel within a wheel. When they moved, they went in any of the 4 directions. Without turning, they moved. The 4 rims were tall and awe-inspiring, completely covered with eyes all around it. When the living creatures moved, the wheels moved beside them. When the creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Whenever the spirits wanted to go, the creatures went in the direction the spirit was moving. The wheels rose alongside, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheel. And when the creatures moved, the wheels moved. And when the creatures stopped, the wheels stopped. And when the creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose amongst them. For the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. Over the head of the living creature was that of an expanse spread out. It gleamed like awe-inspiring crystals. Like under the expanse, their wings was extended one towards another. They each also had 2 wings covering their bodies, and when they moved, I heard the sound of wings like a roaring of a huge torrent, like the voice of the Almighty, and a sound of a tumult like the noise of an army. And when they stopped, they lowered their wings. A voice came from heaven above the expanse of their heads, and they stopped. They lowered their wings, something like a throne within the appearance of the lapis lazuli was above the expanse of their head. On the throne high above was someone who looked like a human from what seemed to be waist up. I saw a gleam like amber, with it looked like a fire enclosing all around from what seems to be the waist down, I saw what looked like a fire. It was brilliant light all around him. The appearance of the brilliant light all around was like that of a rainbow in a cloud on a rainy day. It was the appearance of likeness to the Lord's glory. When I saw it, I fell face down and heard a voice speaking. All right, let's stop there. So, how many interpretations of this are there? This is one of the reasons people either like Ezekiel or don't like Ezekiel. There's a lot that can be done with this passage. This is just the first chapter. And there's a lot of these kind of visions in the book of Ezekiel. And so people who really like these kind of vision speaks and the puzzles and really like this book. Those who do not like this kind of stuff, avoid the book of Ezekiel. It is a book that does throw up some things like, well, and I've heard lots of different ways that this vision of the chariot and throne has been interpreted, including aliens. That's a very popular one. The stars, and they're looking at the different astronomical constellations within the stars and what something. A little vision of God, a theophany, a false gods working their way into the religion. I've also heard lots of other different things that get really kind of weird, but we can agree on some of the things that there's a stormy wind that comes out of the north. Now, the north is related to God's abode. This is a theophany. Remember, I used that word before. Does anyone remember what that word theophany was? Appearance of God. Thank you. It's an appearance of God. A theophany. It's T-H-E-O. That means Theo, God. Phany. P-H-A-N-Y. Theophany. Appearance of God, or a showing up of God. The burning bush was a theophany. I think that's where I first introduced the term. It's not the first one in the Bible, but that's the first one I used that term with, I think. It's a theophany. Now, let's talk kind of what these represent. There are 4 aspects represented here, 4 aspects of God. Now, a lot of people see the correlation here in Ezekiel 4, and the 4 beast in Revelation. John, the book of John, does seem to speak out of Ezekiel, so there's a lot of commentary there. Some people also see like the 4 heads representing the 4 gospels, and like each gospel represents one of the 4 heads. I don't really hold to that because people interpret, well, this one is the human, so Luke is the human, and then Matthew is the. But some people say no, Matthew's the human, and Luke is the. And that just gets real confusing real fast, and I don't see the point in getting all into that. Excuse me, my tablet just crashed, so I don't forget where I was going. Where was I going with that? 4 aspects of God. So we can see 4 different aspects of God within this. It's coming back on, thank you. God's omnipresence. Which is the 4 corners, the completeness of God. Omnipresence, what's that word mean? Everywhere, that's right. All presence. Omni means all everywhere. So all presence. So he's all over. And that's what so one of the most common thing we look at this, the most common denominator about this is that the 4 corners represents God's everywhereness. So we got his omnipresence, his omnipotence, which is another big word, which means omni-strength, all powerfulness. So yes, it's related to his physical. The four faces, eagle representing mobility, air. This one, if you're going to go with the gospel viewpoint on this, this one would be the one most of the time related to the book of John. Ox, which is strength, domesticated animal, so domestication. If you're going to go with the gospel viewpoint, it's one most of the time associated with Mark. There's the lion, lordliness, the wild animals, Matthew. And then man, intelligence, humanity, and Luke, because that's the one that's left. Which kind of makes sense to me. Luke is the one who tries to follow, he's the physician, tries to follow the chronological, that's the historical. And John is easy because it's the most spiritual of all the Gospels. Lion, Matthew, because it's the lordliness. God, Mark is the shortest one, but I've heard different people argue different things on that one. But it shows God in all of creation. He's in the domesticated animal, the wild animal, mankind, and the birds of the sea, and, the creatures of the seas. Because remember, it's still, even though they know it's not water up above and water by this point, it's still looked upon as the two waters. There's still the feeling of the two waters. The water above and the water below. They know it's not at this time, and they're not looking at it as science, but it's still looked upon that as two waters. Remember, the Bible's not a science book. They're looking at it. This is not supposed to compete with Darwin or our theory of physics and whatnot. That's not its point. When we try to make it do that, we take it out of context and make it say stuff it doesn't say. We get in arguments anyways, so his all-knowingness, his all-powerfulness, his omniscience, or omniscience, all-knowing, which would be represented in a wheel within a wheel, kind of like a gyroscope. Cool Earth Suit song, too, if you guys are familiar with Earth Suit. Go count how many times wheel is mentioned in that song. It's like 72 or something like that. It's fun. But it's all eyes around, the eyes all around it, representing that God sees everything, knows everything. Unless you're an ancient alien kind of guy, and then it represents the tractor beam or the. Hey, it's very popular, very popular. Watch the History Channel for any amount of time. You're going to come across that. I think it was in like episode 1 of Ancient Aliens. But there's also God's glory seen in this. So we see God's powerfulness, his strength, his all-knowing, but also his glory. God is on his throne in this, and brilliance from the waist up, so you can't see his face. Remember, no man may look upon the face of God and live, that kind of attitude. Brilliance from the face up, and then from the waist down you can see. And, of course, his response is to fall down on his face, which would be, I expect, the only correct response, unless you're a drunk redneck, and then you might shoot at it. Sorry, just kidding. But falling down on your face would be the correct response. And he said to me in Ezekiel chapter 2:1, and he said to me, Son of man, stand on your feet so that I may speak with you. Son of man, the term son of man is used 93 times in Ezekiel. Now, this is not the same as the Son of Man that Jesus references. Jesus references Daniel when he speaks Son of Man. There's some different ways we know this. But this one refers to so it's non-messianic in this case. This is referring to his dependence on God, mortal man. Now, when Jesus used Son of Man, he's referring to Daniel, which speaks of the Son of Man that comes from the heaven. Daniel chapter 7, you guys can read that. We'll talk about it when we get to Daniel a little bit, but I'm not going to go into great detail on it just because we could be there for several days. But this refers to the mortal man, your humanness. His commission is from 2:1 to 3:27, and he's going to actually have. Do I have it on there? There's the Ezekiel 2:1. There we go. That's what I'm looking for right there. 5 commissions. He's going to be a prophet to a rebellious people. God tells him, you're going to be a prophet to a rebellious people. This is the passage where, you remember that passage that talks about that scroll that tastes bitter? Eat the word, which the judgment is bitter. It's hard to eat. It's about the judgment of Israel and judgment of Jerusalem, and that it's bitter to taste. But there's also the sweet scroll, which is it's God's word. God's word is sweet. There's a hope at the end. It's you got to get through the lima beans to get your dessert. I mean, yeah, you're one of the few. I know. Just kidding. But that's the idea. The scroll tastes bitter. He ate it, and it was sour to his stomach. But then there's that sweetness, the God's word. He's not going to enjoy the message, but he knows that it's from God. That, hey, Jerusalem's going to fall. And he's going to be a prophet to a rebellious people. He's also going to be a prophet to a stubborn people. Because they're rebellious and they're also stubborn and not going to change their ways. That he's going to be a prophet to the exiles. God tells them, you're going to be a prophet to them after the fall. You're going to be a watchman for the house of Israel. What's a watchman? It's a maker of watches, right? No. Sentry. It's someone who stands on the gates, the tower, and looks out and watches for the enemy to come. There's some great deal to be said about a watchman in the society. You know, if a watchman fell asleep and did not tell the people, then they would be held responsible for whatever damages was lost. So if like just a house was burned, they might have to pay for the house. But if life is lost, guess what? Bye-bye you. So there's a lot to be said about that. So he's called to be a watchman, a big responsibility. You're going to be a watchman for the house of Israel. And you're going to be a portrayer of the Lord's action. And so he's going to do some things that we consider really weird. He's going to things like he'll be muted. So he won't be able to use words to portray God's message. And sometimes we'll have God's message here in writing, but he'll have to tell the people God's message without speaking. So he's going to speak in words. His mouth will be so he's going to have to act out God's judgment, act out God's word. He's going to act out some of these things. Charades. This is like a several years of charades. Actually, his mouth will be open towards the end of the judgment section. So like at the beginning of the judgment section, he gets muted. And then towards the end of the judgment section, he gets unmuted. But he'll have to be acting out. Yes? Yeah, his mouth is going to be binded up. It's going to be muted. So yeah, so he's going to have to act out some of this message. Crazy, right? I think my sermon on Ezekiel, I'm just going to get up there and act it out. What do you guys think? I've never been too good at charades. That would be fun, though. Not to have like a whole day where we get people to put together sections of Ezekiel and they can put plays on about the little sections, act out the sections. We should have costumes. That'd be kind of fun. Maybe we should do that one of these days. No speaking part. We can do it all act out, like old silent black and white movies. That'd be kind of fun. That'd be very different. We might have to look into that one of these days. All right, what am I talking about? There you go. The three main parts of Ezekiel, his message. Let's talk about his message. This is his message. So he's oracles of warning before the fall of Jerusalem. Oracles against the foreign nations just after it. And then oracles of hope. We kind of talked about that already. This is his message, though. Warnings, foreign nations, and then hope. You know, one of our temptations in the scripture, as people, we like to side with whoever's the good guy, right? We want to be Ezekiel. But most of the time, when we look at things, we should put ourselves in the place of the people that are stubborn and rebellious. You know, we read the Gospels. Most of the time, we fit in more with the Pharisees than we do Jesus. That's just the way it is. I mean, we should be associating more with the people that Jesus is speaking against a lot in our personal walks. Okay, we're not going to Obadiah yet. Okay, so let's talk about some major points in Ezekiel. He's against false worship. He will speak out against Baal and the high places. He will state that Jerusalem will be destroyed along with the temple. And he will condemn false prophets and idol worshipers. He will use a lot of allegory in his speaking. What is allegory? That's right. It's a story. It's kind of a representation of a person or event by using a symbolism. So you're going to read, when you read Ezekiel, you're going to see a lot of things like the useless vine, which is chapter 15, which is importance of, and then grape is important in that culture, but a worthless vine is good for nothing, and Jerusalem has no worth outside of God. It said, and he will say that you're going to be consumed with fire, and which does happen in 587. Chapter 16, it uses the allegory of the faithless wife, which is a common thread. We've already seen that in Hosea and Jeremiah, associating Jerusalem with with a adulterous wife. Rejected all, there's the allegory of the eagles in 17, which I must admit is one of the most frustrating ones personally for myself, if you've ever read it. Thankfully, they have an interpretation in that one. Verses 1 through 10 are allegory, and then 11 through 20 is interpretation. It's the first eagle represents Babylonia. Top of a cedar tree, which is the house of David. The topmost shoot is Jehoiachin, and they'll be led into exiles. The second eagle is Egypt in that one, and Zedekiah will lead, Zedekiah's ill-advised revolt against Babylon will lead to the destruction of Jerusalem. There's another allegory of eagle, part 2, which is in 17:22 through 24, which is messianic in nature, that there will be a sense of restoration. In 24:15 through 27, we'll actually see the death of Ezekiel's wife. And some people usually see this as a different allegory, but a lot of people think this is really the death of his wife. Wife. It seems like there's the actual illness and death are recorded in 24 and 25, and some people see it as allegory, but it seems like it's pretty real, like she really does die. And he's told not to mourn her death. Just the same as the exiles were not to mourn the fall of Jerusalem. 25 through 32 is oracles against false nations. There is messages of hope. In 33 through 39, we have restoration of the Palestine area. 40 through 48 is restoration of the temple and worship. Most famous passage in this section is them dry bones. Them dry bones, them bones, them dry bones, right? He's taken to a place and he sees the valley of dry bones, and dry bones means there's not even sinew on them; they're just dried out bones, and dry bones can't live. But God puts them together and breathes life into them once again, and the symbolic is that there will be a restoration of Israel and bring life to where it's been scattered and dried out and dead. There's going to be a new life to it. And he sees a sacred river flowing out of the temple from that, which the river symbolizes life flowing from God, the temple, where God's feet, the temple, into the valley and bringing a new life. We're learning real quick that water represents life. The Bible, and it's happening really quickly here, as the whole Lake Mead is drying up, and people are starting to worry about things like growing the crops and what it means for the rest of us. So, sacred river flowing out of the temple. All right, I think that's where we're going to stop on Ezekiel. Let's go ahead and talk about Obadiah. We can do Obadiah pretty quick. Obadiah. I wondered if someone would sing that song. All right. Obadiah is actually a common name. So we don't really know exactly who this guy was, because it's just a common name. His entire book of Obadiah is against Edom for its treatment of Judah. And it will say they will get their just due from God. Eventually, Obadiah will say that the exiles will return and rule over the Edomites. And the whole major focus of Obadiah is that God is the ruler over all the universe. It's universal sovereignty, not just while they were in Israel or in Judah, but when no matter where they're at, God is universal over all the nations. I guess that's enough for Obadiah. No, Obadiah is a really short book. You guys could probably skim through it. It's not long. I do want to talk about the fall of Babylon, because right now we've discussed about, and then next week we'll talk about Deutero-Isaiah. We'll probably stop right after this, because I want to talk about, well, I could probably get through. We'll just go through this. I might be able to even touch on Deutero-Isaiah. I know, I'm going through it real quick. Babylonians. The Babylonians are known as a shooting star. In the Bible, they call them the Chaldeans, because they have such a short-lived history. Their kingship really has Nebuchadnezzar, who dies in 562, evil Murdoch, which is not like evil like with our English sense. Remember, that's a different language. In 562 to 560, just 2 years, he will free Jehoiachin and who will lead in as a ward of the state. Nabonidus in 556 to 539, he will try to change the national religion of Babylon. Which, let me tell you what, I've looked at history, it never works. And then Belshazzar, who followed his father's changes, Nabonidus, and causes major divisions among the people. He will actually never really be king. He's a viceroy. And those are really the four main kings of the Babylonian Empire. After Belshazzar, a new king comes in, not from Babylon, and will overthrow the Babylonians. This is actually one of the most interesting people in the scriptures, in my opinion. His name is Cyrus. Now, if we know anything from Cyrus, he defeats an alliance of Lydia, Babylonia, and Egypt. He's in Isaiah 41, unnamed, as a Messiah character. Instrument of the Lord, anointed one of the Lord. And if we look at him in history, he's a horrible person. Absolute horrible person. Conquered nations, left and right, led in the Persian conquering of the empire, of the world, really, of the known world at the time. The Persians, anyone read the book through the 300, comic book, the 300? No? Seen the movie 300? Yeah, we've got some movie watchers. Not a very good movie if you haven't seen it. So I wouldn't recommend it, but Cyrus leads the Persians. They're the ones that conquer the Greeks in that story, which is very, very loosely based off of history. Very loosely. But Cyrus will be the leader of the Persians, and he's seen as an instrument of the Lord because he will free the people from their captivity and allow them to go home. So when we see in like Nehemiah, when he's talking and he gets to return home, that's because Cyrus has taken over and captured the Babylonians. And that's one of the ways he won the approval, and as the Babylonians had deposed all these people and conquered them. Well, Cyrus comes in with lots of gifts and giving people money and letting them go home. And so the Persians control these areas with the carrot. Babylon uses the stick. Cyrus uses the carrot. It's still control. But he is seen as so that's one of the reasons I think he's one of the most interesting characters in the scripture, because he's a Persian, doesn't believe in God at all, and yet the Bible refers to him as a messianic character. Very interesting. All right, Deutero-Isaiah. Now remember we talked about Isaiah already, and I remember I told you that there was a first half, and then there was a second section of Isaiah, the Deutero-Isaiah, which was written by, most people think by his, by the school of Isaiah, the disciples of Isaiah. And they would have survived long after Isaiah, kept going after Isaiah, and they would have continued to write in the name of Isaiah. And in the scroll of Isaiah. So in Deuteronomy, let's see if I have any. Deutero-Isaiah 40 through 66, it introduces to a new section in the book of Isaiah, and there are changes, historical perspective. In Isaiah 36 through 9, we're dealing with Hezekiah, which is 705 BC. By Isaiah 40, Jerusalem is in ruin, Judah is in exile, Babylonia, and Cyrus is defeating the Babylonians on 539. So we've got a huge time gap, like 200-year time gap between chapter 39 and 40 as you read the scriptures. Yes, it is possible that he wrote in vision, but it doesn't read like it's in a vision form. We read Ezekiel already, where it seems like it's in vision form. This reads like, in Isaiah's not 200 years old. So we see it reads like he is from the school of Isaiah. And it does deal with the decree of Cyrus, which happens, there's the name Cyrus. It does happen in 538, which allows them to return from exile. And he'll actually even help rebuild the country. As the decree of Cyrus will be released out, there will be it will be said in the Deutero-Isaiah that the faithful who were the ones who went into exile did not stay. Now the ones who gave up the comfort they had in the new lands and left and went back are the faithful. Because remember, there's almost 200 years, 160 years in between Hezekiah and 38 and 39. There's 168 pause in that time period. So 160 years, you're going to get comfortable where you got put at. You're going to start developing, a new way of life. And so now he's saying, well, guess what? Now you guys got to give up all the comfort that you have now, that new way of life you've developed. It's time to go back. Some of them will, and some of them won't. But he says the faithful are the ones who pack up and leave. I know, I'm going fast. We got 10 more minutes. I can do this. 4 servant songs in Isaiah. There they are. There's an emphasis on the servant and the servant songs. Now, these ones will often be related and apply to Jesus. Actually, the Gospels themselves will apply these passages to Jesus. Now, at its time, remember, timely message, timeless meaning. The reply to maybe Hezekiah, the last thing, there's some arguments there about who it's referring to. But the mission of the servant, responsibility of the servant, speaking of the servant's mission, trial and death and vindication of this. Like I said, no one really knows the servant at the time of it. Maybe some people say it is Hezekiah, but it's definitely applied to Jesus by the Gospels. So I think that's really the best way for us to look at it as we read it, because the Gospels themselves claim it for Jesus Christ, Jesus the Messiah. The most famous of them being in Isaiah 53. That's the one everyone seems to know.